Hello and welcome to another video tutorial from Vision. Today we'll be creating a responsive image slider that you can use on your websites, and we'll be coding it all using just plain HTML and CSS. This is possible because of the keyframe animations available in CSS3, in which values for different properties can be changed over time. These animations are very well supported on different types of devices, and the performance is excellent because they can make use of hardware acceleration. The animations can of course be triggered with JavaScript, and I will probably be releasing a tutorial on how we can improve the slider with JavaScript later. But today we'll be building everything using CSS only. Here's a demonstration of the final product. We have 3 elements layered on top of each other, and as you can see, the value that we are animating is the opacity. In this other example, we are animating the left property and giving different values to make the layers or the elements slide in and out. This model visualizes how we will build this. We want to create 3 divs with images for the slider. By default, block elements like divs are stacked from top to bottom. By changing the position of the elements to absolute, we can have them layered on top of each other instead. We can then set up separate infinite animation loops for the elements in which we change values like opacity to produce the desired effect. We also want to nest the elements in a relative position parent div, so that we can place a slideshow anywhere in the document. The parent div is represented by the black frame. We want the height of the parent element to adapt to the content, which wouldn't be a problem if the element was not absolute positioned, but as you can see, absolute positioned elements does not influence the parent div's height. The solution is to place a single static positioned invisible image as a placeholder in the div. For the source, we will use one of the images that we are loading anyway. That way the parent div will get the correct size and aspect ratio, and the browser will not need to load extra resources. For the project files, I have created a folder on my hard drive named CSS Slider. And inside the folder is another folder which for now contains original images. The photos are taken by a very talented Danish photographer named Søren Ditlevsen, who has been kind enough to allow me to use them. All the images are in a square format, 1080 by 1080, but I would like to change that to a wider format, so I have opened all the images in GIMP in order to crop them, which I will try to do without completely ruining the compositions. So I go to the image menu and select the canvas size in the drop-down, and I will keep the width of the image, and the height I will adjust to 450. If you're using Photoshop, you can use the crop tool and type in the fixed values. And I think we need a bit more of the sky, so I'm just going to move the layer down a bit here. Okay, now it's time to export the image. Again, if you are using Photoshop, you want to select Save for Web and Devices. If you are using GIMP like me, select Export under the File menu, and make sure you save the image as a JPEG. Then you can adjust the compression, and it's of course important to get the file size down to an absolute minimum without any visible artifacts. If you hit the preview button, you will see a preview of the compression in the viewport, and you can also adjust some other settings. If you're smoothing the image a bit, you can probably compress the image a bit more. So when you're happy with the result, just save the image and repeat the same steps for the 2 other images. Now I have cropped all the images in the folder, and I have renamed them slide 1, slide 2 and slide 3.jpg. But I will just create one more image, or rather a texture, which we will use as a static overlay over the images. So I'm making a new image that is only 2 by 2 pixels. It doesn't need to be bigger than that. because we will repeat it like a checker pattern. We will have to zoom in a lot to see what's going on. Then I will create a transparent layer and I will remove the white background. On the transparent layer I will fill the 4 pixels with black with different amounts of opacity. The overlaying texture will serve several purposes. It will dim the background images a bit and make the overlaying text stand out more. The texture will also, combined with the background image, give the impression of a higher resolution. Remember, the images are only 1080 pixels wide, so with some overlaying grains we can actually fake a higher resolution on screens that are wider than the images. Okay, now I will save the file and I will name it overlay.png, and it's of course important to save it in a transparent PNG format. Now we can start to code the slider. So I'm creating a new HTML document, and the HTML file should be placed in the root of our document folder next to the folder with the images. I will just insert a title and a page heading. Then I will add a style tag called CSS. And first I will set up a few browser resets. I will select all the elements with the wildcard selector and make sure they have a box sizing property with the value border box. That way any borders or margin will not affect the size of the elements. I will also zero out the margin and padding for the HTML and body element. That has got to be enough preparation. Now let's get started making the markup for the actual slideshow. The first element we want to create is a div element, and I will give it a class name, slideshow, and the only style rule that I want to apply to the element is to give it a relative position. By doing so, all our absolute position child elements that we will create in a minute will have their values for size and placement relative to this parent element. The first child element we will create is, however, not going to be positioned absolute, because that is going to be the static positioned placeholder image. And if we take a look in the browser, we can see that the image is visible, but it does not resize with the page. So we're going to give it a class name so we can style it, and I'm going to call it placeholder. And in the CSS, I'm going to give it a width property with the value of 100%. Now the image will stretch to the entire width of the viewport, and when we scale the viewport down, the image will resize accordingly. But like I said, this image would just be a placeholder in order to have the parent div scale correctly. So I will set its visibility to hidden. That way the image will not be visible, but we can see here in the browser that the parent div still adjusts to the dimensions of the image. Okay, let's go ahead and create the actual layers for the slider. We're going to create a div and give it a class name of layer 1. Copy that and paste it a couple of times so we have 3 divs, layer 1, layer 2 and layer 3. And in our CSS we can give them some common properties. We want to position them absolute, and then we want to set the width and height to 100%. We're also going to set the top and the left property to 0. And remember, all these values will be relative to the parent element that we created before. Next we're going to specify some individual values for each element, and we will give each of them an individual background image. Now we could actually place the images in image tags in the markup, but I find background images to be a little more flexible to work with when it comes to having the image cover the entire div. And also background images would allow us to change the images in media queries. That way we could very easily change the images that will be loaded on mobile devices. In the browser we can now see the background image of the top layer, which is layer 3, I believe. The only problem is that the image is displayed with the default background properties, so it will not scale and it will be repeated if the div is bigger than the image. But we can very easily change that. We can just set the background size property to cover. That way the image will stretch to the div size at all times. And just to be on the safe side, we can also set the image to not be repeated. Yes, now the background images are acting like we want them to, and we can start to manipulate their CSS properties with animations. So for the second layer I will add an animation property, and the first value we will specify is the name of the keyframe animation. We haven't created that yet, but let's call it layer 2 anim. Next value will be the duration of the animation, and I will set that to 10 seconds. The last value that we're going to set is how we want the animation to be repeated, so we'll set that to infinite. Now I will copy all this and paste it for our third layer, and there is actually a delay property for the animations, so we might actually be able to reuse the same animation for both layers and then just delay the animation on one of the layers. But I'm going to specify a separate animation, layer 3 anim, so that we can animate individual properties of the layers. Now I'm going to scroll to the top of the CSS to place all the actual keyframes here, because it's a good principle in programming that you declare something before you reference it. It doesn't really matter. You can have your keyframes at the end of the CSS or in a separate file, but I like to have them declared before they're referenced. So the way you declare a set of keyframes is by using the add symbol and write keyframes. Then you type in the name of the animation and a set of brackets. First I will just set up a simple animation with only 2 keyframes to see if everything is working. And we'll set up the first keyframe to occur at 0%. And let's set the top property to something like 5 pixels maybe. Then we'll set up a new keyframe, 50% into the animation. And we will change the top property to 100 pixels. Hopefully that should make our animation layer jump up and down. Refresh the browser, and we now see layer 2 having its top property animated between 5 pixels and 100 pixels, and it will occur over a period of 10 seconds, and the animation will be infinite. Now let's set in the real keyframes, and I have cheated a little bit and prepared those ahead, and I will just paste them in here to our animation. They can just fit on the screen. Basically I have divided the animation into 6 intervals. At 0% I want the opacity of layer 2 to be 0, and I want to keep that value until 17%. At that point I want the opacity to fade in, and at 33% the layer will have full opacity. And I want to keep the full opacity until frame 50, and at that point I will have it fade out again, and the value will be back to 0 at 67%. We don't actually have any values changing at 83%, so it's safe to delete that keyframe. And we could probably also delete 100%, but I'm gonna keep it here for now. Below the declaration of keyframes, I will create a new keyframe declaration for the third layer. And again I will just paste in the values. It's pretty much the same that's going on, except that we want this layer to be transparent until 50% into the animation, and then we will have it fade in to be fully opaque at 67% and fade out from 83 to 100%. And just like before, we can delete the keyframe where there's no actual change going on in the values. I just had them there to make you understand that everything is happening over 6 intervals. and now it's actually starting to look like a slider. In this example, there's no need to animate the first layer, because the two other layers will just fade in and out over the first one. So let's go ahead and create the overlay now. We will make a new div element and give it the class name slide overlay. We will set up some style properties for it. Use the overlay image as a background image. We also want it to be positioned absolute. Actually, we want it to be positioned exactly like the other divs, so let's just grab the properties from there and paste them in. And now we have this grain or raster effect over the images, and it might look weird with some aliasing on the video, especially if you have the video resized. But in real life it looks awesome! So go to the demo page in the video description to see a live example. Let me quickly just set the background attachment to fixed. That will prevent the overlaying texture from flickering when the user scrolls on the page. So now let's add some text for the overlay. We will create a paragraph element, and why not give credit here to the photographer. Then we will set up a few style rules for the text. For the font size, I'm going to specify 6 viewport width units. Very roughly explained, that will mean that every character in the paragraph will take up about 6% of the parent element's width. I will also give it a white color and a black shadow. And there you have it, a nice overlay effect on top of the slider. You can actually easily add HTML or text to the layer divs themselves if you want the text to be animated as well. If we resize the browser window, the text is also scaling very nicely because of the viewport units that we specified for the font size. Now I will just try to paste in some other keyframes. And these keyframes here are just animating the lift property of the layers, but they're using the same timing and everything. We're just animating lift instead of opacity. You can actually also combine several style properties. I'm not going to go through the keyframes in this example, but they will be included in the source code that I'm linking to in the description. Personally, I think the animated opacity looks best, so I'm going to revert back to this. Finally, I'm just touching up a little bit on the general style for the page, changing the heading a bit, and I will also change the font family for the entire document, because I don't think the default Times New Roman font is the best for this. And that about concludes this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed watching and maybe learned a thing or two. Remember that comments, critique and questions are more than welcome. You can use the comment field here on YouTube, or you can go to my website and fill in the contact form there. I always try my best to answer the questions I get. So thank you very much for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe, like and share and all that.